Thanks for the great introduction and setting it up so nicely. This is an important topic for publishers that I think that publishers perhaps don't always realize is one of the most important components of what they do or the service that they provide. I'm a medical editor at the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Until a year ago, I worked for BMJ in London, and so I speak from my experience of working for those two journals. I'm by no means an expert on peer review, but I have had some experience of thinking about the ethical decisions that you need to make and which of these models our journal wants to choose in several journals. What I plan to talk about is the problems of peer review that need solving, and how open peer review might be part of the solution to solving some of those problems. And there are big problems with peer review. It's held up as the pinnacle of the gatekeeper of scientific integrity, and yet it has been shown to be not the case sometimes, as we publish fraudulent articles and made-up articles, and peer reviewers don't always notice that. I'm going to discuss how both the BMJ and the CMAJ approach open peer review and why they've made the policy decisions they've made. And finally, I'm going to make a plug for the formal training of peer reviewers. So here are some of the problems of peer review. We know it can be a slow process, especially for niche research areas or when the authors use uncommon research methods. Open peer review emerged as a potential solution to the problems of bias, abuse, and subjectivity. And some proponents of keeping the identities of peer reviewers hidden would argue that closed peer review allows more openness because reviewers will then have more candor when appraising a paper. But it can really be frustrating for authors to have their paper trashed or cut off at the knees by a person whose identity is not known to them. And the veil of anonymity can, unfortunately, foster kindness or spite in some. Peer review is not great at picking up errors in analyses and therefore in results, because many peer reviewers are not well trained in critical appraisal and research methods. It's even less good at picking up research fraud, but this is simply because it's difficult to pick up fraud when you're reading a single paper. It's something that shows through a pattern of papers. So I'm going to go through a bit of the history of peer review research. Peer review research mainly took off in the 1990s. However, there were a few early trailblazers, and one of these was Ingelfinger. Remember that name because I'm going to mention him again later. He noted in the NEJM in 1974 that the likelihood of two reviewers agreeing on a paper was greater for rejection than for acceptance. And Cole and colleagues, writing in Science in 1981, reported that two different grant review panels agreed only 70% of the time on decisions for funding, which gives some insight into the size and effect of subjectivity as a component of peer review. A similar effect was shown by others about 15 years later. And apparently, to achieve a statistically significant recommendation according to our usual cutoff in science, we would need to have 6 peer reviewers all recommending rejection or acceptance of a paper. And we all know that this never happens. In fact, in my experience, we would usually get 2 peer reviews, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. It would be just too time-consuming, costly, and difficult to try to get 6 reviews for every paper, and then the notion that all the reviewers could agree is almost laughable. So what would authors prefer? Perhaps this. I prefer beer to peer review. Drink a beer with the author. It's rare to find an investigator who cannot participate in a pity party about their experience of peer review as being unfair. The process is held up as being beyond reproach and the safeguard of research integrity, but many authors still experience peer review as being unfair. So how to ensure fair and high quality peer review? Now, open peer reviews is signing reviews. Some see that double-blind peer review is a form of open peer review, but that's debatable. Does it reduce quality of peer review if we ask authors to sign their reviews because they will say less or be less candid? Or does it make for fairer peer review? And what else might get us more rigorous peer reviews? Acknowledging peer reviewers in some way, giving credits, more expert selection of peer reviewers. This is an editorial training issue. What about what I have affectionately called highly open peer review, or HOPPER, because that's acronym's easy for me to say. That is making peer review comments available for all to see, either post or pre-publication. Some would argue that the best way to ensure peerless peer review is to bring it well out into the light of day, so that readers of research can judge the quality of peer review process for themselves. So there have been some research studies done into open peer review, and I'll give you a flavor. Going back to masking authors' identities and whether this works. A study in 1990 found that in 27% of cases, reviewers could guess the identity of authors when author details and affiliations were entirely removed from a study sent for peer review. And this is quite understandable because reviewers are often other researchers in the same field, and some specialist research fields are very small. With regard to signing peer review reports, Godley and colleagues published a randomized trial in 1998 in which they reported that asking reviewers to sign their reports made no difference to the quality of reviews received or recommendations made. However, there is some lack of willingness to review, reduced willingness to review. For this, these investigators developed a reviewer scoring tool that they published a validation study of in 1999, and it is still widely used as a score for peer reviewers. You might have used it yourself, but there is some inter-rater variability. So from the early 2000s, BMJ, many other journals, in fact before BMJ did it, many other journals did it, began to use open peer review where reviewers are asked to identify themselves to authors. So they're asked to give their names, signing their peer reviews, and their affiliations. And what does this mean in practice for a journal, for a publisher, for editors? It means being clear in your instructions to peer reviewers and in your reviewer invitation letters that this is your policy. And if reviewers don't like open peer review, they must not accept to do the review. If they do submit a review and then subsequently ask not to be identified, the review cannot be taken into account to be in keeping with the policy. There's still the option to contact editors confidentially by email in cases of suspected plagiarism or serious fraud, for example, but these exceptions should be handled in an ethical manner by editors. So is this better for authors? Some would say yes, and others still experience frustrations with an unfairness in the process of peer review. What about post-publication peer review, just as a precursor to talking about highly open peer review? Goethe and colleagues evaluated the practice of post-publication peer review, and that is e-letter comments on studies following publication and how well these are addressed by authors. So they began a research on a series of BMJ papers in 2003 or 4, and they only published their findings in 2010. And Goethe and colleagues concluded that substantive criticisms of their research were addressed adequately by authors only 45% of the time. This is after publication. So we're still seeing serious errors in research papers, and peer review is not infallible. Then the BMJ undertook a randomized controlled trial where 3 investigators began to evaluate open posting of peer review. They started this in 2001 with some papers where the reviewers were asked if they would mind if their peer reviews were published on the web, and some were not. This was only published again in 2010. One of the authors died during the study, and there was a delay. And the study was called Effect on Peer Review of Telling Reviewers That Their Signed Reviews Might Be Posted on the Web. So how did they operationalize this? Well, the BMJ to this day doesn't publish peer review material openly on the web. They do engage in open peer review in terms of reviewers signing their reports. But there is a group of papers for which there is, you can see on the right-hand side there, extra publication history. And these are the papers from the randomized control trial. And if you click onto that link, extra pre-publication history, you come across the pre-publication material, which is in web appendices. It's the originally submitted version of the paper, the peer reviewers' reports, the decision letter, the statistician's reports, and the author's response letter. So you can see all previous versions and how the peer reviewers' comments were addressed. And they have made a collection of all these papers, which you can find at that link. So if you get the slides here later, I think you do, you could go and look it up. And the conclusion of this study is quite telling. They concluded that telling peer reviewers that their signed reviews might be available in the public domain on the BMJ's website had no important effect on review quality. Well, fine, that's good. Although the possibility of posting reviews online was associated with a higher refusal rate among potential peer reviewers and an increase in the amount of time taken to write a review, which these are things that really matter to editors, because when you are hunting for peer reviewers for a paper, it's extremely frustrating when you can't get someone to peer review it. But they cast that aside in their conclusion, and they said that they believe that the ethical arguments in favor of open peer review more than outweighed those disadvantages. But it's fairly telling that the BMJ hasn't operationalized this in day-to-day carryings on, and I think that it is because of the high commitment, the increased workload commitment, and how you would do this for potentially every single paper that came through. So, for example, the BMJ has about a 6% acceptance rate. They might get about 10,000 papers a year, of which they would send maybe 4,000 for peer review. Now, if you have to send 4,000 papers for peer review and you have to ask all those reviewers if they don't mind if their peer review is on the web should the paper be accepted, you're going to get a lot of refusals. So I'm just in conjecture there, but I think that this has something to do with it. Anyway, just after the study was published in 2010, BMJ Open was launched as a new open access journal in the BMJ publishing group, and they decided that they would operationalize highly open peer review. So you can see a BMJ Open paper, and on the left-hand side highlighted is review history. And then if you click on that review history, you will find all the things that we saw in the previous example. Now, I work for CMAJ, and in the beginning of 2013, CMAJ Open was launched, which is also an open access peer-reviewed journal, online only. And in the instructions to reviewers, CMAJ Open makes it very clear that CMAJ Open is committed to open peer review, in which peer reviewers' comments, author responses, and previous versions are available along with the final version. So here's a screenshot of a CMAJ Open paper. Now you see that they call their thing something different. Also on the right-hand side, slightly highlighted under full text, you can see online appendices, which is perhaps a little less clear because it isn't clear to the reader that those are the reviewer's comments, and you might not be prompted to click on it if you didn't know that the journal had open peer review. So it may be very slightly hidden. And what you find if you click on that is you find the paper's appendices, and then as well as that, the reviewer's comments, the original submission, and usually the decision letter, although I don't see it there. Which is all good. And currently there's this movement within the CMAJ to make CMAJ a highly open peer review journal, which we're going to take to our board meeting. One of our editors, Erin Russell, has done a quick and dirty research study to compare CMAJ Open and CMAJ reviewer refusal rates over the year of CMAJ Open being working in 2013. And she found that for CMAJ there was a 23% refusal rate, and for CMAJ Open, when authors were asked, do you mind if your peer review is open for all to see, then their refusal rate was 20%. So, and it wasn't a statistically significant difference. Despite all this transparency, it can still be difficult to get a good peer review and to detect fraud. With respect to the former, many journals have thought about and made forays into training peer reviewers. And there's as yet no formal competency-based training program for peer reviewers. So this is what David Mower tells me. He's at the University of Ottawa and one of the founders of Consort. And he's been looking into programs that offered peer review training and finds them to be lacking. Most peer reviewers go through a process of mentoring. Sometimes it's good, sometimes not so good. Or they follow tools that are available on the web, or they make the process up as they go along. And I know they do make the process up as they go along because I've had some terrible peer reviews that have not been helpful. Yes, this paper should be published. I like it. Well, that's not very helpful to wait 3.5 weeks for that. The BMJ does have resources for peer reviewers on their resources pages. Interestingly, the main resource that they link to is this BMJ book published in 2003 by Mower and Haddad, which almost certainly requires some updating now. So what is needed to do a good peer review? Well, you need a very good knowledge of research methods and skill in critical appraisal, and this, I think, is where a lot of reviewers fall short. The excellent and useful reviews that we get from people who understand the importance of using the right methods to get the answer that you want. Subject expertise, obviously, is really important. Time, not to be undervalued, because doing the time it takes to provide a good peer review, to read the paper carefully and to critique it properly, can take the better part of a day. And I think that sometimes people accept a review without understanding this time commitment. And we should make that clear, what we expect. Charity. What do I mean by that? Well, now we come back to Ingelfinger, who in 1975 wrote a Christmas piece in the NAGM about peer review, and he talked about this characteristic as being required for conducting appraisal of research. And he means that charity, in the biblical sense, as in the 3 most important things in life are to be kind, kind, and kind. And sometimes it takes time and guidance to develop the finesse to be encouraging and constructive. Some people have that naturally, some people have to be taught that. This is something that journals can encourage, and after all, we are in the business of improving research and its reporting. So I'd like to argue that it is really publishers that should be taking the lead on developing and implementing the training tools for peer reviewers. We should be investing in that area and safeguarding scientific peer review as the gatekeeper of scientific research. It's in our interests to work towards keeping peer review peerless. None of this. And that's me. Thanks, over to you, Keith.